Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're jumping right in to completely dismantle a deeply entrenched public myth. We're going to look at how massive, incredibly rigid organizations actually manage to adapt when their backs are entirely against the wall. We're pulling directly from James A. Russell's absolutely fascinating research on the Iraq War. Specifically, we'll be looking at how military units fundamentally changed the way they fought between 2005 and 2007. Now, even if you are a total history buff and know this era inside and out, I guarantee you the real story of how the U.S. military transformed its tactics on the ground is probably very, very different from the one you remember.
So let me just ask you right off the bat, what really turned the tide in Iraq? If you follow the widely accepted historical narrative, the answer seems pretty straightforward, right? You'd probably point to the spring of 2007. You'd point to the surge of 20,000 additional troops. You'd point to General David Petraeus taking command. And of course, the highly publicized release of that new official Joint Counterinsurgency, or COIN, manual back in December 2006. It's this neat, tidy story of top-down leadership swooping in to save the day. But actually, there's a massive knowledge gap here.
Let's break down this comparison. The popular myth, the one we've all kind of absorbed, is that Washington strategists and high-ranking generals basically wrote a new playbook, sent more troops, and fixed the war. But the ground reality? Well, the source data tells a completely different story. The undeniable truth is that organic, localized, bottom-up innovation by desperate units in the field was happening as early as 2005. We're talking long before the surge and way before that official doctrine was published. Brigade and battalion commanders in places like Anbar and Nineveh were completely rewriting how they operated on their own. They didn't wait for a manual. Frankly, they couldn't afford to.
All right, Section 1. The counterinsurgency disconnect.
To really get why these units had to innovate so drastically, we have to understand the massive, almost unbelievable disconnect that existed between the command headquarters and the front lines during those early years. Look, the U.S. military arrived in 2003 totally prepped for shock and awe. They were structured for a conventional, high-tech war against Saddam Hussein's army. They relied on effects-based operations, focusing on destroying very specific targets to paralyze the enemy using speed and precision-guided munitions. And hey, they won that initial conventional fight in just 3 weeks. But as we all know, they quickly found themselves completely immersed in this complex, multi-layered insurgency. And here is the kicker. The troops facing this insurgency had zero operational guidance from high command on how to fight it. None. Pre-war doctrine barely even mentioned the word asymmetry.
Take this quote for example. In October 2005, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice went before Congress and super confidently described the U.S. strategy as clear, hold, and build. Now that sounds great on television, doesn't it? It sounds like a solid, cohesive plan. But when you look at the historical record, military commanders on the ground literally had no idea what she was talking about operationally. Those buzzwords had never been translated into an actual military strategy or communicated to the forces who were, actually fighting the insurgents. The disconnect was just staggering.
This timeline just perfectly maps out how wildly delayed the top-down response was. The invasion hits in March 2003. Then throughout 2004 and 2005, you've got this rising, highly lethal insurgency, and you start seeing ad hoc adaptations happening locally in provinces like Anbar and Nineveh. Now check this out. The official Joint COIN manual isn't even published until December 2006. That is a full 18 months after field units started organically innovating on their own. These troops were figuring out how to survive and stabilize entire regions a year and a half before Washington and top generals finally handed them the official playbook.
Moving right along to Section 2, bottom-up battlefield innovation. So if the solutions weren't coming from the top brass, how on earth did these massive, traditionally rigid military units figure out how to fight a totally new kind of war? This organic survival instinct brings us to the concept of organizational innovation. And Russell is very specific here. He defines this not just as short-term, ad hoc tactical adaptation, like, welding extra armor onto a Humvee, but the actual development of entirely new organizational capacities built in war that fundamentally change what the organization does. We're talking about units completely transforming from conventional combat squads into forces capable of full-spectrum operations. Think local politics, police training, intelligence gathering, the whole shebang, and all of it while under active fire.
Okay, so how do they actually pull this off? It boiled down to an iterative, four-step process. First up, ad hoc tactical adaptation. A unit tries something just to survive. Maybe it works, maybe it completely fails. Second, Information sharing. Instead of waiting around for official doctrine, young officers started sharing what actually worked via digital networks and informal blogs. Third, this newly shared knowledge led to new standard operating procedures right there at the local level. And finally, all of this culminated in broad organizational innovation. Honestly, when you look at it, these units acted way more like agile tech startups rapidly iterating their software to survive a hostile market than the rigid, unyielding cogs in a military machine that we usually imagine.
Let's look at a couple of super specific examples. Down in Ramadi, the 1-1 Armored Brigade completely flipped their tactics. Instead of hunkering down on massive bases and just driving out in armored convoys, they dispersed their troops straight into the city using local combat outposts. They started building relationships block by block and effectively re-energized the local police force. Up in Nineveh, you had the 172nd Stryker Brigade, utilizing Blue Force Tracking, which is a digital system to map out the battlefield, fusing intelligence and command networks totally on the fly. And across the board, critical knowledge was being shared informally through platforms like Army Knowledge Online. They absolutely did not wait for orders. They essentially hacked their own bureaucracy to win.
Which brings us to Section 3, Rethinking Military Adaptation Theories. Now, this ground-level reality, it completely forces us to throw out the old textbooks and rethink how we understand adaptation in massive organizations. Because what happened in Iraq totally defies traditional academic theories of military change. Look at the dense academic theories. They almost all assume change comes from the very top or happens during peacetime. Barry Posen argues that military organizations are change-averse and only innovate when civilian leaders force them to. Deborah Avon says change only happens when you alter the institutional reward system, like who gets a promotion. Stephen Peter Rosen argues it stems from peacetime bureaucratic struggles. But Russell's analysis of the actual Iraq reality, it totally shatters all of those assumptions. The innovation we saw was wartime, bottom-up, and organically driven by field commanders who hadn't been given any new rewards or top-down civilian directives to change.
And here is just a fascinating, almost ironic fact derived directly from the source material. In Iraq, the military ended up developing exactly the opposite kinds of competencies initially called for by their civilian masters. Think about it. Before the war, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld aggressively pushed for a high-tech transformation of the military that strictly avoided any kind of nation-building. Yet to just survive the insurgency, the troops on the ground independently mastered those exact nation-building skills: local security, diplomacy, police training. They innovated in the exact opposite direction of their official mandate, simply because that is what the reality of the ground demanded.
Section 4. The Real Organizational Transformation.
As we start to wrap up this explainer, we really need to nail down what this real organizational transformation actually was and why understanding this history is so incredibly relevant to us today. The key takeaways from the ground reality in Iraq show us that the true transformation was all about decentralized authority. Power and decision-making were pushed way down to the tactical units. Hierarchies were flattened out, crossing traditional military and civilian lines just to get the job done. Ultimately, the successes engineered from the bottom up became so undeniably effective that they effectively pulled the official doctrine along behind them. The 2006 Coin Manual didn't invent these tactics at all. It just codified what the front lines were already doing. It proved, without a doubt, that even the most massive, rigid bureaucracies can become dynamic learning organizations under extreme fire.
This whole thing perfectly illustrates a historical reality that the great military theorist Karl von Clausewitz noticed ages ago. He said, "War is the realm of uncertainty. 3/4 of the factors on which action in war is based are wrapped in a fog of greater or lesser uncertainty." That famous fog of war is exactly why relying entirely on a flawless, top-down plan is so incredibly dangerous. When the initial plan fails, and let's be real, it almost always does, the absolute necessity is having a culture that actually allows for ground-level adaptability.
So that leaves us with a pretty massive, provocative question, one that goes way beyond military history and cuts right into the realities of whatever organization you might be a part of today. When an unforeseen crisis hits, does your organization wait for a top-down manual from leadership to tell everyone what to do? Or do you empower the people on the front lines, the ones actually staring the problem in the face, to rewrite the playbook? The true story of the Iraq surge tells us that survival and ultimate success often depend entirely on the latter. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this sparked your curiosity, and I'll catch you next time.